Hi, my name is Taylor Griffin, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello and welcome to a special live episode of Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Thomas Krasnation.
And I'm Nick Pareso. There are few people in America who understand politics the way our guest today does. David Axelrod began his career as a reporter and columnist for the Chicago Tribune, and then reinvented himself in the 1980s as a communications strategist for political candidates in the Midwest. After 2 decades consulting for congressional and gubernatorial races around the country, Mr. Axelrod joined the 2004 U.S. Senate campaign of a young Illinois state legislator named Barack Obama. Just 4 years later, David Axelrod and his team of strategists were credited with orchestrating Mr. Obama's successful campaign for the presidency of the United States. After President Obama's election, Mr. Axelrod was appointed senior advisor to the president, where he coordinated policy and communications during the first 2 years of the administration. President Obama's re-election in 2012 was Mr. Axelrod's final political campaign. He now runs the nonpartisan Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, works as a senior political commentator at CNN, and hosts the Axe Files podcast.
After retiring from politics, Mr. Axelrod published a memoir entitled Believer. In it, he describes some of the difficulties President Obama faced upon ascending to the presidency in the midst of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the unanticipated challenges of the relationship between the White House and the Department of Defense. For today's live interview, we're sitting down with Mr. Axelrod and a few dozen of our classmates, professors, and friends at the Harris School of Public Policy to discuss his career in politics and his thoughts on the highest levels of civil-military relations in the United States. David Axelrod, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you for your service.
So before we dive into your political career, we would be remiss as a podcast on civil military affairs and covering military politicization to not talk about the reports that came out over Memorial Day weekend regarding the USS JOHN McCAIN. For those who aren't aware, there were reports saying that the White House had requested the U.S. Navy to hide or cover up the destroyer, the USS JOHN McCAIN, in preparation of the president's visit to Japan.
Yeah.
Our question for you is, at the time that you worked as a senior advisor in the Obama administration, your boss was actually a political opponent of John McCain. During your time at the White House, could you imagine you and your staff taking these kinds of steps to, for example, on a visit to a naval base, prevent him from seeing the USS John McCain?
No, and we should point out these. There are other examples of the White House leaning on the military for optics. We all remember the mission accomplished banner during the Iraq War when President Bush was president. I'm sure they would love to have that back. But this one was different because it had to do with a figure who, whether you agreed with him or not on specific issues, was indisputably an American hero. That carrier honors not just John McCain, the senator, but his father and grandfather, who were both distinguished members of the military. And so it was deeply offensive, and it does raise questions about the politicization of the military. So, I was upset. And let me point out, I believe that you can have deep disagreements over politics and public policy and still respect each other. John McCain was one of the first guests we had when I started the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. He was my first guest on my Axe Files TV show on CNN. And I just spoke at the Sedona Forum that's sponsored by the McCain Institute just a few weeks ago. I had deep respect for John McCain. Differences over issues, yes, but respect for him as a person, as a public figure. I think his voice is missed.
And he is a man of such great stature, and that's one of the things you had to include in your political calculations for President Obama's 2008 campaign. Can you talk a little bit about how you drove the narrative of contrasting President Obama from the rest of his political opponents, Hillary Clinton and then John McCain in the general election?
Yeah, it was interesting. Let me say as a preface that when we sat down to talk to Senator Obama about the possibility of a campaign, his concern was less about the primary than about John McCain, who was at that point the front runner. This is instructive for everyone who's watching this race now. In the spring of 2007, everybody was writing him off and said he had missed his chance, and then he ended up being the nominee of the party. But when we were talking, he was clearly the front runner, and Senator Obama said, I think John McCain would be a tough opponent because he is an iconoclast. He challenged orthodox thinking when he ran for president in 2000. He's, been there on climate change and immigration and some other issues. He had real concerns about him as an opponent. As it turned out, I think Senator McCain was, the tide was too strong. President Bush ultimately had a 28% approval rating by the time the election rolled around. McCain had to make peace with elements of the Republican Party with whom he really didn't have a close relationship. In order to be the nominee, he had to embrace some of the Bush policies with which he had previously disagreed. And he just was too encumbered by all of this to be the candidate who he might have been and the candidate he was in 2000. And Barack Obama was the candidate of change in 2008 in a country that was hungry for it. And McCain couldn't overcome that.
More specifically, though, what was your strategy for convincing American voters that Barack Obama would be the commander-in-chief that the country needed here in the midst of two wars?
No, it was an obvious question. He was 4 years out of the Illinois State Senate. I think that if you think back to that time, and it's painful for me to say that you guys were probably in junior high school at the time, but if you think back to those times, the war defined everything, the war in Iraq, and there was a general consensus among the public. The majority of Americans had come to believe the war was a mistake. And one of the things that differentiated Barack Obama from the field was that even as a state senator from this district, by the way, a state senator running for the U.S. Senate in 2002 and 3 and 4, he took a position against going to Iraq before the war. And his critique, if you look at Google today and look up his speech made in the Federal Plaza here in the fall of 2002, was really prescient. And he talked about that he feared a war of undetermined cost, undetermined length, and undetermined consequences that would unleash sectarian war within Iraq and would make America a greater target for terrorism. All of those things turned out to be true. And while he may not have had long credentials, he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the national security realm. His analysis going into Iraq was a real certification of the fact that he had thought hard and long about these issues.
So he was anti-war on Iraq, but in regards to Afghanistan, he had called it a, quote, necessary war.
Yes.
And a war we could win.
Yes.
Why did he say that?
Well, we went to Afghanistan because we were attacked from Afghanistan, and there was a linear logic to that, and we knew that Al-Qaeda was basing there and ultimately across the border, and that in order to secure our country, that we needed to deal with that issue. His concern during that campaign, and he spoke to it, was that we were so focused on Iraq, and you remember at that time we were trying to write the strategy in Iraq, the surge was going on and so on, that very little thought or strategy was being applied to Afghanistan. And that was another issue that he raised in the campaign. Look, one of the best speeches that he ever gave was his Nobel Prize speech. And that's a whole nother story about the Nobel Prize, something that we didn't expect and candidly didn't particularly want. It was a kind of a lightning bolt. Mm-hmm. Just as an aside, Robert Gibbs, his press secretary, called him the morning he got the Nobel Prize, and president said, it's 6 a.m, the president says, "Gibbs, are you kidding? Is this some kind of joke?" And Gibbs said, "Sir, I assure you I wouldn't be waking you up to play a joke on you. You won the Nobel Prize." And Obama kind of sighed and said, "All I want to do is pass health care." But in his Nobel speech, he talked about the paradox of receiving this award even as he was a wartime president, and talked about the fact that there are wars of necessity, and Afghanistan, when we went there, was a war of necessity.
So you mentioned healthcare already. We know that after being elected, even as a wartime president, commander-in-chief doesn't get to spend 100% of their effort on war policy or national security policy. So talk a little bit about how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan fit into the administration's overall portfolio the first 2 years.
You know, you're quite right, Thomas. One of the things about the presidency is that you don't get to choose. You have, there's incoming all the time, and you have to deal with all of them, not just one thing. He came to office at a time of great economic crisis, the worst since the Great Depression, and 2 wars. I don't think any president, in our lifetime faced that combination of challenges. And so one of the reasons that he asked Bob Gates to stay on as defense secretary is because he thought there was a need for continuity, and because he understood that he had to deal with a series of things at once, and he didn't want to have a new defense secretary having to learn the ropes, and at a time when he was going to be relying on the defense secretary to help work through where we should go in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was challenging. I remember a day in March of 2009 when he started the day with a briefing on North Korea. Some things never changed. There were some rumblings about movements in North Korea that were concerning. So his intelligence briefing went long. Then we went into a meeting about whether he was going to intervene to save the American auto industry, and that meeting lasted for 45 minutes. And he said, "We need more time on this. We'll reconvene tonight." He went off to do a town hall meeting on the economy, had meetings in the afternoon on Iraq and Afghanistan. Then we reconvened and had a 2-hour meeting on the auto industry. And when I got back to my office, I slumped in my chair, and Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff, called and said, "Get in here right away. Fargo's underwater." There was flooding. And I just thought, this has to be an episode of The West Wing. This can't be real. This can't be real life. So one of the great challenges of the presidency is you don't get to choose, and you have to deal with all of it, and you have to be reliant on people around you, synthesize information and issues, and you have to have a broad team, both in the cabinet and the White House, to work these issues through.
And you said that was in March of 2009. In the latter half of that year, a Gallup poll showed that public support for the president and the war in Afghanistan had been declining, down to 35% approval for the war in Afghanistan. Was there ever a sense that kind of that public support was declining and that the public was getting tired of the war in Afghanistan?
I don't think there's any question. Look, we're still there today. I mean, there was weariness then with the war. And both wars. I mean, we had 180,000 troops in Afghanistan and Iraq when we arrived. So, we were well aware of that, but we also knew that if we were going to stabilize Afghanistan to the point where we felt we could responsibly remove a lot of our troops, then we were going to have to do more there, and we were going to have a strategy, and that strategy was going to have to involve not just Afghanistan, but what we did about cross-border incursions from Pakistan. And as you know, and I'm sure that you're going to want to talk about it, there was a very lengthy process of review. But I just, one of the reasons I was proud to work for the president, I know the impression, we all write from different perspectives, and Secretary Gates, for whom I have enormous respect, just did a TV show with him wrote his perspective